We headed toward a gap between low hills, which I believed led to Jüterborg, where the 12th Army should be. The distance between the burned ground and that gap was barely a kilometer, but the terrain was uneven and the panther could only advance slowly, with the column stumbling in our wake. We traveled 100 meters, with the panther shaking as if it were about to explode, then another 100, and by then the survivors of our column took off running in fits and starts, frenzied, drawing on their last reserves of energy, and hoped to give that last push. I saw a group of houses ahead, which I thought might be the outskirts of Jüterborg. The artillery began to fall on us. Large-caliber cannons that tore large chunks from the ground and scattered them into dust. These explosions fell to our right, and the debris knocked down some of our men who were running on that side. Then the red gunners recalibrated, and the projectiles fell in front of us, forming a curtain of explosions through which we would have to run. I threw myself to the floor of the turret, hearing the roar of shrapnel and stones against the armor. A projectile fell near us, and the shock wave made the entire panther flatten and then bounce as it passed over us. The shock wave went through the panzer, making blood spurt from my nose and leaving my ears ringing. I realized that the engine had stopped, and I vaguely heard the driver try and start it. I decided that the panther was probably finished and ordered the crew to get out and seek shelter before the entire vehicle overturned from explosion. We stumbled out of the panzer and threw ourselves to the ground near the houses. Our column was already taking refuge there. The shattered windows and doors revealed huddled groups with their hands over their heads. I also glimpsed a group of Soviet infantry soldiers at the edge of the houses, also seeking shelter, caught out in the open by their own bombardment. I saw a house with a basement window at ground level with the shutters open, and I jumped in there. Crouching in the basement, I discovered that it was occupied by several small children, girls of 6 or 7 years old, and 2 women. The women had the children huddled against them, and their faces were contorted with fear. The explosions outside made the entire floor rise, and pieces of masonry began to fall from the walls. While the bricks were falling between us, a pair of boots appeared at the foot of the stairs, and a man burst into the shelter, followed by another. They crouched on the floor and stared at us. They were Russian. They were young, barely 20 years old, and wore thin tunics, backpacks, and steel helmets. The red star on the pockets of their chests shone brightly in the light from the stairs. Each man held an automatic pistol with a cylindrical drum. They looked at me, at the children and the women, and then at the flashes of the explosions at the top of the stairs. Then they shrugged and sat against the opposite wall with their weapons in their hands, without taking their eyes off us. I could feel the weight of my pistol in the holster. The Reds showed no sign of violence, despite my uniform. One of them smiled at the children and winked, making explosion noises with his throat. An explosion outside caused dust to fall from the ceiling. The children shuddered and moaned. The cheerful Russian reached into his pocket and showed them a photo of his family. The children looked at it in silence and then looked at me expectantly. Eager to reassure them, I groped for the photo of a young stranger I was carrying in my pocket and showed it to them. Everyone nodded, the children, the women, and the 2 Russian boys. Debris continued to fall on us from the explosions. One of the soldiers took off his steel helmet, extended it, and placed it on the head of a little girl, saying something in Russian. The girl's head was almost hidden by the green steel helmet. The man leaned back, with his head uncovered. There was an explosion right at the entrance at the top of the stairs, and debris flew down the steps and fell on all of us. I crouched down, covering my head, and threw myself in front of the children. I heard shrapnel breaking on the stairs and hitting the walls around us. I looked up. The Russian man without a helmet had been hit in the forehead. Where the helmet would have protected him, a long piece of shrapnel protruded from a wound. He seemed dead. His friend was taking his pulse, looking for signs of life, and then muttering angrily. With burning eyes, he looked at the child with the green helmet and reached for his weapon. I shot him twice in the chest, then leaned down and shot him again in the head while the children screamed. The corpses were lying in front of us as the bombardment continued. When there seemed to be a truce in the bombardment, I told the women to come with me and abandon that place, joining our journey to the west. They refused, preferring to stay in their basement, not caring about the outcome. To avoid more problems than they already had, I called my men, and we took the Russian corpses out of the basement and left them in a crater some distance from the houses. The column of soldiers was slowly gathering among the destroyed buildings, with people emerging one by one or two by two. After several attempts, my crew started the Panther again. We formed our column and advanced towards the gap between the hills. The next troops we saw were German, and they shouted at us to keep moving forward, that the 12th Army was just ahead. These troops were guarding an 88mm cannon and a couple of Hetzer tank destroyers entrenched to protect the hills, so we believe they were not deserters. We began to find more troops, entrenched in trenches or defending artillery emplacements, who told us that the 12th Army's corridor was still open. With the Panther at walking speed, our disorganized and bloodied convoy entered the corridor, and we began to advance westward. The corridor was barely 3 kilometers wide, and, on each side, there was constant fire and columns of smoke, as the screens of the German 12th Army tried to contain the Soviet pincers seeking to crush the security zone. Red planes flew at full speed above us, but there was heavy anti-aircraft cover with 20mm anti-aircraft tanks using ammunition in abundance. We saw how they shot down a Sturmovik, its wings twisting in flames before crashing into one of the hills flanking us. The center of this corridor was full of targets for the red J-bows, columns of troops that had managed to break through the sieges and pockets to the east, solitary panzers like ours, and some groups of armored vehicles, in addition to numerous horses and carts for the civilians. The few farms in the region burned fiercely, many with improvised cemeteries in their yards instead of orchards and animal pens. In one of the yards, there was a T-34 overturned in a crater, and in another there was a Stuka Panzerbuster with the cockpit open, surrounded by dead cattle with their legs in the air. Everywhere, there were infantry soldiers or civilians who were rummaging while advancing with difficulty towards the west, under trees whose branches were blackened by the fires. If some of us had imagined that the area of the 12th Army would be safe, it became clear that the danger there was still very great. At one point, the protective screen on our left seemed to give way, and the German infantry of the 12th Army began to return en masse to the central zone, in full retreat, which increased the confusion around us. The officers stopped them by shooting into the air, and several soldiers who had thrown away their weapons were murdered in cold blood. Even so, the gap in the defenses was still there, barely a kilometer from us, and the sound of tanks could be heard among the explosions of projectiles. From the top of the dome, I saw 2 of our Stugs emerge from their hiding place next to the road and head towards the dangerous point. The crews of these Stugs were teenagers, perhaps 16 years old, and they must know that they were going to their deaths. They were going with expressionless faces, their eyes bulging with fear and amphetamines. I turned my Panther and moved to support them, and although my vehicle only worked in second gear, we traveled a few hundred meters through the trees and undergrowth separating us from the corridor screen. We passed an official car among the bushes, in which 2 majors of the Wehrmacht were traveling, both middle-aged, but in good shape and without injuries, who were waiting in their luxurious car for passage to be guaranteed to them. Thanks to the sacrifice of those young men, as we passed, we grazed the car and tore off a wheel, and we positioned ourselves in a firing position, for where we could barely see the edge of the corridor. The situation there was hopeless. The 2 Stugs were firing at a phalanx of T-34s approaching through a gap in the defenses. An 88mm PK cannon was also firing from a bunker, and the remains of our infantry were crouching in trenches and craters, grabbing Panzerfausts. A group of men from the Volkssturm, about 50 years old, marched quickly beside us, with Panzerfausts and rifles at the ready to help close the gap. These men were immediately hit by the explosion of a projectile, and their bodies were dismembered on ground. A band of eyewitness, Russian collaborators who feared being recaptured by the Reds more than anything, ran forward and seized the weapons of the dead. These Russian deserters threw themselves into battle with the reckless courage of men whose death sentence had already been pronounced. My gunner fired at the lead T-34, stopping it dead, and 2 German soldiers rushed in with Panzerfaust to finish it off. The rockets tore off the front plate of the Red Panzer, while the Red crew continued trying to escape through the hatches. The T-34 began to explode from within, with the ammunition from a main cannon shooting out of the fractured hull in spirals of smoke and sparks. My Panther was hit by the other T-34S, and a projectile split the front edge of our turret, so I could see daylight between the wall and the roof. Another projectile impacted on our front plate and bounced upward in a shower of debris. I told the gunner to fire all the ammunition we had left, and with those few projectiles we had left, we hit another T-34 that was charging against our 88mm position. We knocked down the turret of that Panzer, but the hull continued to advance, staggering violently, until it crashed into the PK position and crushed the 88mm crew under its tracks. Following my orders, my Panther began to retreat, without fuel or ammunition to continue fighting, while the Stugs and their teenage crews continued fighting, firing and firing at the rows of T-34S arriving from the fields. From somewhere, 2 new Panthers joined the defense. Vehicles that looked fresh from the factory, with perfect paint and equipment installed on the hulls. As we retreated and headed toward the central zone, we saw many of the highwaymen running out of ammunition stand up and walk toward the T-34S, deliberately exposing themselves to deadly fire. For the Highways, it was better to die like that, quickly and anonymously, than to spend the rest of their lives in the Gulag, knowing that, due to their collaboration, their families also shared that fate. The 2 infantry majors whose car we had just grazed tried to stop us, demanding that we take them, brandishing their pistols. I was not in the mood to put up with those idiots, so I jumped out of the turret and disarmed them. We searched their car and found 2 drums full of gasoline in the back. 2 full drums. That was enough for another 30 kilometers. The 2 officers frowned as we filled the tank, then offered us a box of gold watches if we accepted them as passengers. We took 2 Panzerfaust from some men of the Volkssturm who were running past us, armed the 2 majors with them, and sent them to the front with kicks from our studded boots. The Volkssturm assured us that the officers would be a valuable asset, like an entire platoon of Panthers, and began to push them with carbines. The corridor's perimeter was shrinking by the minute. The red planes flew in circles over our heads, zigzagging between the anti-aircraft guns and firing at the fleeing columns, or dropping fragmentation bombs along our route. In the air, these bombs separated into small containers of explosives, scattering violently over a huge area and exploding in torrents of steel balls and shrapnel. I thought I was immune to death and wounds, but what we saw in those final kilometers was appalling. A civilian bus, commandeered by staff officers, got stuck in a pothole and was struck by a fragmentation burst. The thin sides of the bus were shattered, and the bodies of the officers inside came out to the road while soldiers passing by trampled the wounded. A group of political prisoners dressed in striped pajamas was being used to pull carts full of belongings, suitcases, paintings, and furniture, under the orders of an SS unit. A red plane fired at the procession, blowing the paintings and golden frames into the air and knocking down the prisoners and the SS. The prisoners who survived ran or staggered towards the trees in the direction of the perimeter, some grabbing the weapons they had taken from the dead SS. In a house we passed, 2 old men were hanged by ropes on the shutters, with a sign around their necks. We show a white flag to the red monsters. The white flag was wrapped around the corpses, waving in the wind. A group of armed civilian women had cornered a Russian infantry soldier in the hallway and were asking the soldiers who passed by what they should do with him. He remained standing, bareheaded, with a somber face, as his fate was discussed. No one was interested in him, and the women simply shot him in the head with a pistol and got on a cart that was passing by. A red fighter was hit by anti-aircraft fire high up and crashed into the trees, turning an old oak into a flaming torch as tall as a steeple. The pilot jumped out by parachute and got tangled in the branches on the other side of the road. He hung there, 30 feet up, trying to free himself, the object of indifferent gazes from those passing with difficulty, until someone shot his body. Meter by meter, we began to leave this area and entered an area where there were stretches of long, narrow meadows protected by fir trees. In some meadows, German planes had tried to land, perhaps escaping the east and exhausting their fuel here. In one field, there was an abandoned Focke-Wulf fighter simply resting on the grass, its engine hood steaming in the light. In another field, a Junkers 52 plane had crash-landed on its belly, and a man with the rank of general was kneeling on the ground near it, vomiting in the grass. A few minutes later, beyond the trees, we saw shapes moving in another of those lush meadows. I could see a flash of metal through the fog, and there was a smell of gasoline in the area. I dismounted from the Panther and advanced with an infantry soldier to see what was happening. I expected to see red tanks maneuvering to take positions or isolated elements of our armor hidden, awaiting the end of the surrounding battles. Instead, as we advanced between the trees, with submachine guns in hand, we saw an image that few Germans had the privilege to see. Through the fog, as the sun dissipated the steam, the flashes of pale metal became a defined outline, which at first was blurred by the fog, but then became clearer. In a few moments, as the metallic object moved through the isolated pasture, both I and the accompanying infantry soldiers held our breath and lowered our weapons. The object was a plane of a design that we had seen in the newsreels and in the military magazines, presented as the best of its kind, but none of U.S. believed that we would see one in person. It was a Messerschmitt 262, the legendary Schwalbe, or jet-powered Swan, the elegant twin-engine creation that was one of our wonder weapons. I was surprised by how big it was in the newsreels. It seemed much smaller, and also by how rudimentary its construction was. Its metal panels were evidently hammered by hand, and its cladding was unpainted, except for the German cross on the fuselage and the swastika on the tail fin. It has no propellers, one of the infantry soldiers said. Hier ist Wunder. Here is a miracle. The plane remained balanced on its wheels, which sank into the grass. It was being dragged by a team of oxen, the simple draft oxen raised in this part of Germany for thousands of years. The oxen were tied together with a rope that was hooked to the landing gear of the 262, and meter by meter, those ancient beasts, guided by a 10-year-old boy, dragged the jet plane through the grass towards the safety of the trees. We common soldiers were speechless at that scene. What did that mean for us in Germany? Our wonder weapons existed. They were there before our eyes, and they were magnificently designed with the greatest science humanity could muster. But the machine was crudely made. It was irregular, and it was dragged like a medieval cart on its wheels by a herd of oxen, each of which left behind a cloud of flies. And it was losing fuel. Splashes of liquid gushed from its hull, impregnating the entire forest with an unbearable stench. Don't light cigarettes, friends, or you'll all get fried. A Luftwaffe pilot crouched next to us, smiling. He was middle-aged, with a tired look, sunken cheeks, and thin hair slicked back over a bald head. He wore flight boots, perfectly polished, but his mustache was yellow from nicotine. He told us how the plane had landed in an emergency maneuver in the meadow, spilling precious fuel, more valuable to the Reich than gold. "But how will I get to the west now?" he murmured. "Everything is lost. Maybe I'll smoke a cigarette anyway when they're gone." We shook his hand, eager to shake a legend's hand. Our complaints and bitter jokes about the Luftwaffe were momentarily forgotten as we watched them drag the magnificent plane to the shade of the elms, where, the pilot told us, they would keep it until it could somehow return to service. As I left the thicket, the mooing of the oxen began, a sound I recognized as that of the pack animals being unhitched from their load. A minute later, the entire corner of the forest behind us lit up, and we turned to see a colossal orange fireball rising above the trees. The fireball dripped burning fuel, spinning on itself as it ascended, so hot that it burned fog from the treetops within a radius of hundreds of meters. The farmer who had driven the oxen came running after us, screaming in hysterics. He lit a cigarette, the crazy man, as if he wanted to die. Little by little, these scenes and many others were left behind, and the sounds of the fight from the perimeter became more distant. Our Panzer creaked and rattled at a snail's pace through a smoke screen, with eyes full of tears that we had not shed in battle, and we entered an area that seemed organized with some discipline. The men of the Kettenhund directed traffic and defenses, and improvised emplacements gave way to properly constructed ditches and trenches. The troops here were a mixture of new and exhausted soldiers, and the equipment was also new and old. Several immaculate PK cannons, with wheels barely muddy, were manned by gunners who looked like scarecrows, thin and ragged. A unit of Hitler Youth troops, with clean uniforms and recent haircuts, defended a defensive point consisting of an old Panzer III without wheels or tracks, located on a mound of barbed wire. The troops came from a wide variety of units and regiments, including armed police and men of the Volkssturm. Surprisingly, there were also field kitchens that handed out a plate of hot soup to anyone, soldier or civilian who passed. I ate my ration in the back of the Panther, leaning on the turret, surrounded by wounded men and children. The engine smoke covered us with dirt, and the gases made us nauseous, but we were inside the 12th Army sector, heading towards the Elbe. As we passed a group of soldiers huddled around an armored vehicle, one of them turned and shouted something at us. I didn't understand it, but some of the children heard and started pulling my sleeve. Feldwebel, what's wrong, kid? The Führer is dead. We stopped next to the group of soldiers and listened to the radio for a few minutes. They announced that Adolf Hitler had died in the battle for Berlin, just 30 kilometers north of our location. The war continued the same, without the hope of a final victory. Some women were crying, and some soldiers were openly talking of suicide. I hardly felt anything except the pain of the wound in my back, for which I took my last dose of medication. The 12th Army sector around Brandenburg, facing the Elbe, was a landscape of destruction and constant movement. The perimeter was defended by the remains of the 12th Army and fugitive soldiers of the 9th, but the entire area was being heavily pressured by the Reds, except for the Elbe itself on the western border, which faced the silent and motionless Americans on its shore. Huge columns of vehicles and people made their way through the rolling countryside toward the river. The Reds controlled the sky despite our anti-aircraft artillery, and their Jabos frequently flew over, strafing columns, buildings, and open ground. We knew that, if the Russians wanted, they could reduce the sector to rubble. They were holding back, waiting for the war's end, and, perhaps, trying to maximize their capture of human beings. From the sky, leaflets cascaded, urging everyone in the sector to remain still and stop resisting the Red Army's advance. Hitler is dead. Berlin has surrendered. The war is meaningless and must end now. In addition, voices spoke to us through loudspeakers amplified to an incredibly high volume. They were the voices of the Seydlitz officers, and the warm spring breeze carried them for kilometers through the landscape. The words were indistinct, but we could distinguish surrender, peace, life, goodwill, and some others. We listened to this and the hum of the planes overhead as we joined a huge tide of people heading toward the river. It was already rare to see armed troops. Most had thrown away their weapons and were walking with their hands in their pockets or holding backpacks. Most of the epaulets and other signs of rank had been removed from uniforms, and the meadows were full of badges, caps, and boots. Civilian clothing was now highly valued, and many men wearing agricultural workers' pants and shirts had the bearing of recent soldiers. There was plenty of eau-de-vie and other alcoholic beverages, and many people were seen lying drunk at the road's edge, numb to what they had witnessed and the fears that gripped them. The fields and the edges of the roads were full of abandoned vehicles, both motorized and horse-drawn. There were some panzers among the trucks, the Kübelwagens, and the cars, but it seemed that most of the armored vehicles had been abandoned in the Kessel and in the other combat zone. Our Panther was the only one of its kind that we saw, and it was about to fail us. At a crossroads, a huge crater prevented the passage of heavy vehicles, and pedestrians crossed via a wooden bridge. We tried to go around the obstacle with the Panther to reach the meadows, but the fields near the river were swampy and the tracks soon sank deep. It made no sense to try and get the machine moving forward. The Elbe River was a short distance away, there was no fuel left, and the engine was in danger of catching fire. We drove the old Panzer into the swamps, knowing it was the end and not wanting the machine to fall into other hands, be they Russian, American, or even German. After taking out the wounded and civilians, we drove the Panther in second gear for a few more meters until it crashed into a body of water surrounded by reeds. It began to sink with the engine in front. We jumped out and watched it sink. With smoke rising in the air, the front plate rose and the long cannon dripped swamp water. The dome, from which I had seen so much and given so many orders in the heat of battle, filled with stagnant water and sank below the surface. There were some final bubbles and smoke. I stood there in silence as green algae accumulated on the Panther, and when the surface calmed, I turned to my crew and we walked to the front of our small column along the crowded roads to the great River Elbe. The area near the river was full of people of all kinds. Civilians, unarmed troops, and some combat troops who were still carrying weapons. Among them were men of the Waffen-SS of the Panzer Corps who were making their way through the crowd in front of them, pushing people out of their way. I could see the river at the foot of the slopes, above the heads of the thousands of people trying to get there. The water looked black, and the river was about 200 meters wide. At that point, there was only one bridge that crossed the river, since the other bridges to the north and south had been destroyed in April to prevent the Americans' passage. It was a narrow bridge, made of wood and steel, and when we reached the slope, I saw the reason why so many people were still waiting to cross. The bridge was blown up in its central part, and only one row of people could pass, one by one, to the American side. The American shore seemed practically deserted. There were no tanks or artillery emplacements, nor any American infantry that I could see. I spoke with a lieutenant from an artillery unit who was next to me in the crowd, and he told me that the Americans had withdrawn their men several kilometers west of the river. They don't want a conflict with the Russians, he said, shrugging, but look at all these people. There must be between 50 and 60,000 people here. Will our friends let us all cross? I squinted to look toward the opposite shore. The line of people who had already crossed the damaged bridge stretched across the meadow on that side, moving with difficulty to the west. There is a huge pile of abandoned small arms, carbines, rifles and machine guns, helmets, and Panzerfausts, indicating that the troops did not need them once in American territory. I saw some men trying to cross the river by swimming against the swollen and fast current. Some emerged on the American shore, but many seemed to disappear under the dark water and not resurface. Someone had tried to build a boat with a bridge pontoon, but it slowly sank while its crew rowed to cross, and the men slipped under the water. In front of us, the SS men were punching through the crowd in their haste to reach the riverbank. Shots rang out, and in a minute, we passed over the corpses of 2 artillery cadets who, evidently, had tried to argue with the SS. There were other corpses abandoned on the ground, wounded men and civilians who had succumbed, and others in their last agonies who had no one to help them. Lost children wandered among the thousands of adults, crying for their relatives. The civilians in my column picked up half a dozen of these children, and we stayed together as we slowly advanced towards the bridge. At the entrances, there were troops guarding the bridge and trying to extort money from people waiting to cross in exchange for letting them pass through the crowd. For a gold watch, a good camera, or a diamond ring, you could go straight to the bridge without waiting. At first, people cursed these troops, but the sound of a bombing behind us on the slopes above the river and the screams of the wounded from the explosions caused many offers of payment. The crowd swayed, and people fell to the ground and were trampled. From somewhere, a horse broke through the crowd, kicking and trampling anyone who got in its way, until it was shot down. When a red plane flew low, without firing, but low enough that we could smell the steam from its exhausts, the crowd panicked and tried to storm the bridge entrance. Many people were crushed or trampled, and, as expected, the most fragile and weak were the ones who suffered the most. The banks of the river were steep clay cliffs, and many civilians fell into the water and did not resurface. In the midst of all this chaos, the remains of my column finally managed to get onto the bridge, and we began to cross in single file, with the water 20 meters below us, barely passing through the damaged section in the center. Setting foot on the opposite shore felt strange. Throughout everything we had seen and done in our flight from the Kessel, the idea of the American shore of the Elbe had been constantly in our minds. now that we trod on grass, without a single American soldier, panzer, or plane in sight. The sensation was unreal, as if my feet were numb. With my crew and the fragments of infantry and civilians who still accompanied us, we left our pistols and other weapons in the pile of short weapons, a pyramid of metal that rose to a height of 4 meters. The only things I kept were the photo I carried in my pocket and the iron cross of the capo with its ribbon, which I had snatched from his body on the sunken road. When we turned to leave, a Kettenhund approached, staggering. He was drunk and pointing a gun at us. Our civilians moved away from him while he pointed the gun at the medal I held in my hand. "I'm going to take it from you," he said, reeking of liquor. "You haven't earned it," I replied. "The American boys pay me $10 for an Iron Cross," he laughed. He used the American word bucks instead of dollars, as if he were now one of them. "I'll give you $2 for yours, so you can eat and shave." Just as I hit him in the face, he shot me. That's how my war ended in May 1945 on the western bank of the Elbe, under American occupation, but without an American in sight. After 2 years of fighting, after Kursk and the retreat west, after the Halby Kessel and the fields full of corpses, after everything that shamed me and everything that made me proud, my war ended with a drunken Kettenhund who put a hole in my shoulder blade. As I lay on the western bank of the Elbe, watching the boots of my Panther crew kick the Kettenhund man right there, I could only close my eyes to the sky and accept that everything we had done had come to an end. My crew took me to a Red Cross center in the American zone, a makeshift hospital in an abandoned school on the outskirts of Hanover. My wound was extensive, and added to the one I already had on my back, recovery was slow. I spent days on the school grounds, listening to American radio programs and playing cards. At first, the food they gave us was so rich and sweet that it made me vomit, since my stomach was used to Wehrmacht rations and water. The German men stood by the table at mealtime and shook their heads, amazed to see the hot dogs, scrambled eggs, rolls, cookies, and Hershey bars that we could buy in the store. The nurses were Red Cross volunteers and nuns from various countries. They could not have cared for us better. My uniform was folded in a locker, and I wore old civilian pants and shirts that they gave me in the hospital cloakroom. I shaved every day and smoked cigarettes in the sun. The patients did not talk to each other about their war experiences. Once I saw a new patient arrive who had been injured in a knife fight. I seemed to recognize him as one of the SS men from the bridge, but I didn't say anything, and neither did he. My Panther crew was dispersed to prisoner processing camps in the American and British sectors, and I heard that the civilians who had been in our column simply disappeared into the German landscape. I was interrogated by an American sergeant, who only wanted to know if I was a member of the National Socialists. He was not very interested in my war record. There were simply too many of us to process. May 1945 gave way to June and then July. Now I was absolutely convinced that it had been a wise decision to surrender to the Americans, because everyone knew that the information we had about our prisoners in the East was nil, literally nil. The millions of men who had surrendered to the Reds east of the Elbe had melted into the Soviet system, and nothing was known about them. Some said they were in the Central Soviet republics, places beyond the Caucasus Mountains that could now well beyond the moon. Others said they were in Siberia or Mongolia, from where, as the Highwiss and the Red prisoners had always told us, not even the Russians could ever return. In the West, we felt vindicated in our determination to escape that fate, although many of us also felt uncomfortable, knowing that luck had played an important role in our diet of hot dogs and chocolate. At the same time, the future of Western Germany was becoming clearer. The Western Allies were investing in the reconstruction of the cities they had destroyed. Everything could be bought with money: coffee, cosmetics, weapons, gasoline, morphine, color magazines, cameras, bourbon. I was offered a Jeep if I could gather 10 Iron Crosses and Luger pistols to go with them. "They have to be Lugers," my American contact insisted. "Walthers are no good." The streets were full of German girls walking with American soldiers and shadowy German boys watching them pass. The atmosphere in the streets, curiously, was similar to that before the war, when the future seemed full of possibilities. My future, however, was uncertain. My only family was the Wehrmacht, and I had no home, job, or resources. At night, the hospital ward was full of crying and screaming as the men dreamed of battles. Some nights, I didn't allow myself to sleep, knowing that I would see the Halby Kessel again and, above all, the dead Russian in the basement, whose friend gave his steel helmet to the German boy. Why did that Russian visit me at night, after all those I had killed, the thousands I'd seen die? Was it because I had shown him the photo of the girl I carried? I was lying in bed, in my own mental Kessel, wondering about all this. I knew the time to leave the hospital was near. One after another, the wounded Germans at the hospital were able to leave, and most were discharged and rejoined the civilian population. The nurses saw that this worried me, but didn't understand why. "But you have your sister," a nurse told me after changing the bandage on my shoulder wound for the last time, as we contemplated the humid rain on the windows of the room one afternoon. "Or is she actually your girlfriend? The photo you keep?" I did not answer. "What is her name, Wolfgang? You have never told us her name." The photo was in a frame on my closet. I had made it myself with pieces from a medicine box and had put glass on it that I found in the gardens. I looked at that photo every day, remembering the girl's mother and the way she died in the back of my Panther in the Kessel. To be honest, I had begun to imagine a new life with that girl and the remains of the family she had left to replace the total absence of family in my life outside the Panzer troops. If I have to be honest, I had spent my time in the hospital imagining my future life with that girl and a house that we could have in the American sector and me finding a well-paid job, maybe working on machines. Any lonely man knows the kind of thoughts I had. What was her name, Wolfgang? I had no idea of her name, but there was an address on the back of the photo in a city not far from the Elbe, and the more I thought about that girl, the more I thought I should go and visit her. And that is how, in early August 1945, I left the hospital dressed as a civilian with a tie, a backpack, and a small bouquet of flowers that the nurses made for me because they knew where I was going and why. I found someone to take me in a mail truck and then in an agricultural cart, both driven by men my age who certainly had been in the war. We did not ask each other for details. Observing the streets, full of people working, cleaning up piles of rubble, and rebuilding their houses for the future. People lined up, passing bricks from hand to hand, while American excavators cleared entire blocks and American trucks brought loads of wood and concrete to rebuild everything. Had the Americans forgiven us? It seemed so, and I felt that the Halby Kessel was now a distant past, and that its secrets would remain locked forever in the forests east of the Elbe and in the minds of those who had witnessed those events. Now, the United States was our future, where everything could be forgiven, forgotten, and lost. When the cart stopped in front of the address, I felt that that was also my future, that new world of building and forgetting the past. The house was shuttered and the doors locked. My heart was beating with apprehension, as it used to before a fight, getting no answer from the silent house. I asked a neighbor if she knew the girl, and I showed her the framed photo. The old woman took me to her house, which was next door, and sat me at a table in a darkened kitchen. "Does she still live here?" I asked her. "Where is she?" The neighbor twisted a rag in her hands. "The Americans have been very good to us," she said. Yes, I already see it. But what about this young woman? The Americans have been generous and have restored order. We are very fortunate here compared to those in the East under the Reds. What the women there have suffered is indescribable. Yes, we are fortunate. I myself made great efforts to reach the West, to escape the Reds, I told her. Now I see that the trip was worth it. But this girl, where is she? We have no complaints against the Americans, young man. Hopefully in any army there are one or two bad apples, a small number of troublesome soldiers. I'm sorry, young man, but the girl in your photo is no longer with us. Has she left? She has died. It is very unfortunate. In any army, there are one or two who do not obey the law. We're lucky the Americans have so few compared to the Russians. Please, do not get angry or seek revenge. The fact is, the young woman was murdered by an American soldier weeks ago. If you want to know the details, he was drunk, raped her, and then strangled her. But you see, the law has been applied. The man is in a military prison, and it is said that he will be hanged for the crime. Our mayor is friendly with the Americans and says the man will surely hang. But these types of events are very rare, almost unheard of, as you can imagine, in the American sector. Now, we must all try to forget this event because it is not good to remember these things for a long time. I nodded in the dark kitchen, listening to reconstruction noises outside. I walked away from the house at sunset, crossing the summer fields, not knowing where I would end up. In those meadows, there were armored vehicle depots, where long rows of our Panzers were lined up in the grass, rusted, abandoned, and silent. The small Hetzers, the Stugs, the large Tigers, the large Panthers, all waiting at sunset, empty, row after row, spilling oil, with birds making nests in their turrets. It seems that when a war ends, there is too much metal left, too much steel, and all Panzers lose their value. The neighbor was correct. It is not good to remember these things for too long.